Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will continue with the clustered interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar and the fact-finding mission on Myanmar. And in order to do this, I hereby declare open the 30th meeting of the 37th session of the Human Rights Council. I can give now the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Ireland thanks the Special Rapporteur and aligns with the statement of the EU. Ireland thanks the Special Rapporteur and fact-finding mission for the reports they have provided. Ireland shares the concerns of the High Commissioner on the human rights situation in Myanmar, and we are particularly concerned by recent allegations emerging from Rakhine State of the existence of mass graves and further destruction of Rohingya villages, which supplement the existing extensive and credible reports of grave human rights violations. Ireland is also deeply troubled by the reported conditions of those who have remained in Rakhine, including recent reports of restrictions on access to food and continued violence and human rights abuses. Ireland reiterates its call on Myanmar to urgently establish greater access to the region for UN agencies and NGOs in order to fully assess and address these needs. These latest reports absolutely reinforce the urgent need for the government to provide access to the UN fact-finding mission so that these reported human rights violations can be fully investigated. Ireland recognises the complexity and challenges of the political situation in Myanmar and urges Myanmar to address this crisis and instability in other states, including Kachin and Shan, in cooperation with the international community. Ireland urges Myanmar to take all measures required to protect civilians without discrimination and to fully observe international human rights norms in line with Myanmar's commitments to strengthening its democracy. Madam Lee, we are gravely concerned by the reports of reprisals which you have highlighted. What recommendations would you make to Myanmar authorities to ensure accountability for these egregious attacks? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Laos People's Democratic Republic, please.
Madam Vice President, at the outset, my delegation would like to associate itself to the ASEAN Joint Statement delivered by the distinguished representative of the Philippines. Laos PDR, as a neighboring country, is closely following the development in Myanmar, including development in Rakhine State. We understand the concern of the international community on the humanitarian situation in Rakhine State, and we also understand the complexity of the issue. We are of the view that the recommendation of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, headed by former UN Secretary General Mr. Kofi Annan, are in the right direction. We commend the effort and commitment by the government of Myanmar to promote and protect human rights in the country and to a sustainable solution that would lead to peace, stability and development for all communities between the Rakhine State. The Laos PDR welcomed the agreement between Myanmar and Bangladesh on the arrangement on return of displaced persons from Rakhine State, including the TOR for the Joint Working Group on repatriation process. We believe that the situation in the Rakhine State should be solved through the constructive dialogue with the understanding of the context and background of the complex issue. In conclusion, we call on the international community to positively and constructively engage with the support Myanmar in her effort to address the humanitarian situation in Rakhine State. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Belarus, please.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Belarus in principle does not support the adoption of country resolutions and country mandates which are not universally recognized. The presence of such mechanisms, in our view, does not fully facilitate a dialogue on an equal footing on the thorny issues in Myanmar, which is an essential condition to seek effective ways to settle the crisis. In a difficult transition period, this country needs support in order rapidly to overcome these many problems. We believe it is important in this connection to draw on the potential of regional and bilateral formats of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I give the floor to Iceland.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Iceland would like to thank the Special Rapporteur and the independent international fact-finding mission for their work. The Human Rights Council held a special session in December to pass a resolution on the human rights situation of the minority Rohingya Muslim population and other minorities in the Rakhine state of Myanmar. During that meeting, Iceland expressed its concerns over reports that human rights violations continued, urging the government of Myanmar to put an end to the violence and to address the situation in accordance with its international obligations. We were therefore alarmed to hear the High Commissioner last week inform us that ethnic cleansing appeared to be still underway in Rakhine state, with people continuing to flee to Bangladesh and victims reporting killings, rape, torture and abductions by the security forces and local militia. We were especially disappointed to hear that deliberate attempts to force the Rohingya to leave the area through starvation were being made, with officials blocking their access to crops and food supplies. Madam Vice President, this Council, the world as a whole, cannot sit quiet. We must do our utmost to ensure that the government of Myanmar ends the violence and the abuse, and that there is accountability for human rights violations committed. I thank you.
Thank you. Now Slovakia has the floor, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Slovakia aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We thank the Special Rapporteur for the report and commend the members of the fact-finding mission for their valuable work and oral update. Slovakia follows the current situation in Myanmar closely and remains highly concerned by the continuous campaign against its Rohingya population in states of Rakhine, Kachin and Stan and other conflict-affected areas. Although we notice a relative decrease in the level of physical violence, we are alarmed by the allegations of forced starvation, which is used by the state authorities as a method of oppression against Rohingya people. Therefore, we call upon the government of Myanmar to end this practice and return to compliance with its human rights obligations. Furthermore, we condemn the reports of recruitment of child soldiers by the armed forces of Myanmar. In this regard, we would like to urge the government of Myanmar to refrain from this unacceptable abuse of the rights of the child. In the same spirit, we invite the government of Myanmar to avoid the detention of children on the basis of their alleged association with armed groups. Madam Vice President, we call upon the government of Myanmar to cooperate with all relevant UN agencies and mandate holders and to allow full and unhindered access of these bodies to all parts of the country. Slovakia remains committed to help Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, including through offers of humanitarian aid. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you, Your Excellency. The floor goes to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Madam President. The OIC Independent Permanent Human Rights Commission is following with great concern the deteriorating human rights situation in Myanmar. Persecuted based on their race, religion and origin, the Rohingya minority of Myanmar represents one of the worst examples of victims of ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity in modern times. In January 2018, the OIC and its Independent Human Rights Commission undertook a visit to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh and met Rohingya refugees to get first-hand information on the human rights situation faced by them in Myanmar. The horrifying tales of human rights violations narrated by the Rohingya refugees included systematic and systemic discrimination in denying all sorts of their civil, political, economic, social rights, in addition to widespread and indiscriminate violence resulting in torture, rape and extrajudicial killings that did not even spare women, children and elderly. Eyewitnesses also counted details of dreadful events which included torching of hundreds of Rohingya villages, brutal torture of thousands of innocent civilians by the military using helicopters and rocket-propelled grenades that resulted in hundreds of extrajudicial killings and forced hundreds of thousands to flee their homeland to save their lives. Based on the testimonies received from a wide range of Rohingya victims, IPHLC affirms that the situation carries the hallmark of an organized campaign of ethnic cleansing, which is a crime against humanity under international law and must be stopped by all means. Madam President, IPHLC calls upon the government of Myanmar to take firm steps to A. Immediately end the violence against Rohingya and bring the perpetrators to justice. B. Ensure a sustainable and voluntary return of Rohingya refugees in safety, security, dignity, and with ensured livelihood. C. Take concrete actions to implement the recommendations.
Thank you. Sorry, your time is up. I give the floor to the Republic of Korea, please.
Thank you, Ms. Vice President. The delegation of the Republic of Korea appreciates the update of the fact-finding mission led by Mr. Podhorský and Special Rapporteur Ms. Yang Li and their devoted work on this urgent issue. My delegation recognized that some progresses have been made since we last met. The government of Myanmar reached an agreement with the government of Bangladesh on the concrete plan to implement the physical arrangement for repatriation of displaced Myanmar residents from Bangladesh on January 16, 2018. It is a step in the right direction, and we strongly encourage the relevant parties to abide by the agreement. My delegation also urges the government of Myanmar and Bangladesh to fully cooperate with the relevant organizations. My delegation also appreciates the commitment of the government of Myanmar to implement the recommendations of the final report by the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State. Notwithstanding the aforementioned positive developments, however, my delegation remains concerned over the situation on the ground. There is still an array of challenges, and they warrant our urgent attention. Taking account of the recent observations of the UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights who visited Bangladesh last week, we encourage the government of Myanmar to take all necessary measures to ensure the protection of the human rights and the safety of all persons, particularly with the full guarantee of safe, dignified, voluntary and sustainable return from Bangladesh. We strongly hope that the government of Myanmar will sincerely cooperate with UN, particularly with fact-finding mission and the current special rapporteur, by providing unhindered access to the country. In this regard, we are concerned about the fact that no access was given to the special rapporteur this past January. The Republic of Korea has offered humanitarian assistance of around $4.6 million in cooperation with multilateral channels and reaffirms its commitment to support endeavors to resolve the crisis in the Rakhine State peacefully with full respect for the human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Libya, please.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My country thanks the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Myanmar for the presentation of the report, and we strongly condemn the events affecting the Rohingya in Rakhine State, as well as the genocide, forced expulsions, displacements, rapes, and so on. We call for the perpetrators of these crimes to be brought to justice, so that they may be judged for these shameful acts. It is essential to guarantee the protection of the fundamental human rights of the Rohingya and other minorities on the legal, practical and political levels, and end racial discrimination affecting them. It is essential to take immediate measures to end these deplorable acts, such as forced displacement, so that they may return in dignity to their places of origin and have humanitarian aid distributed accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you. We shall now turn to our list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations, and I can give the floor to the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, please.
Ms. Vice President, we welcome the Special Rapporteur's report and fact-finding mission statement and share the concern. Given these concerns and those recently expressed by the Human Rights Commissioner, High Commissioner, Assistant Secretary General and Secretary General, there should be no doubt Burma, Myanmar is one of the most concerning human rights situations in the world, where ethnic cleansing continues even as indication of a genocide surface. We welcome the reporter's call for a field-based structure in Cox's Bazar and urge that this be considered in conjunction with the High Commissioner call for a UN mechanism to prepare expedite criminal proceedings in court against perpetrators. The Council should also urge all options for independent accountability process, including the International Criminal Court. We echo the reporter's view that the current situation in Rakhine is worse than what it was before 25th August. It is impossible for refugees to return in safety and dignity in these conditions. Such a return may only be possible when the full citizenship and identity are recognized by law, and after all discriminatory laws, regulations and practices that target the Rohingya are abolished. We call on the Council to echo these preconditions. We share the experts' concern on the escalating violations in Kachin, Shan and other conflict-affected states. We echo the view that the peace process appeared to be losing momentum. Increased troop deployment in the ceasefire zone led to intensifying conflicts and displacement, while public consultation intended to feed into the Panglong Conference have been actively suppressed. We fear the international ceasefire agreement is being used to window dress serious violations. The Council should express concern on this and note the close connection between violation in these states and Rakhine states, which indicate wider patterns. We ask the experts if they have come across such a pattern that cut across Rakhine and northern state in their work. Lastly, we ask the experts to elaborate on how all UN bodies sees the matter could utilize their expertise to further accountability. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to Human Rights Watch, Mr. Fischer.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The world has watched in horror as Myanmar's military has carried out a vicious campaign of ethnic cleansing in northern Rakhine State, forcing hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims to flee to neighboring Bangladesh. Human Rights Watch has documented massacres, gang rape and mass arson that amount to crimes against humanity. The government has barred both the UN fact-finding mission and the Special Rapporteur from the country, along with denying independent media and human rights groups genuine access to northern Rakhine State. Authorities have used heavy machinery to clear at least 55 of some 362 burned villages, obstructing justice by removing evidence of the crimes committed. Other serious human rights concerns in Myanmar should not be ignored. In northern Myanmar's Shan and Kachin states, fighting between government forces and ethnic armed groups has displaced thousands of villages and left others trapped and isolated. Here too, the government has blocked aid to those most at risk. Myanmar's government has shown an increasing indifference to human dignity and basic rights. The dream of a democratic transition lies in tatters. UN member states need to face this uncomfortable reality and act accordingly, as real progress will not be possible without ending impunity for atrocity crimes. The Special Rapporteur and Fact-Finding Mission have underlined that accountability is needed to bring long-lasting peace, stability and democratization to Myanmar. Relying on Myanmar's government to provide justice for victims of serious violations is wishful thinking. We urge the Security Council to refer the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. But this will not happen overnight. The Myanmar government's attempts to literally bury the evidence show the need for immediate international action to facilitate future prosecutions. The Special Rapporteur has urged the establishment of a structure with experts with a particular focus on collecting and preserving evidence for inclusion in a master database for international criminal proceedings. And we also support the High Commissioner's call for the international community to establish an impartial, independent mechanism to support investigations into atrocity crimes. The Council needs to act on these recommendations, and it needs to do so now. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Christian Solidarity Worldwide has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Christian Solidarity Worldwide welcomes the continued efforts of the UN Special Rapporteur and further welcomes the work of the fact-finding mission. CSW is concerned that the government of Myanmar has not cooperated with the fact-finding mission and has also denied the Special Rapporteur access to the country. CSW calls on the government of Myanmar to allow unhindered access to UN representatives and international humanitarian aid agencies. CSW remains concerned by rising militant Buddhist nationalism, which has created an atmosphere of religious intolerance. The violence against the predominantly Muslim Rohingya in 2017 follows decades of severe persecution and is now a humanitarian crisis involving ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity. While CSW welcomes the establishment of the Rakhine Advisory Commission, there is a long way to go. In August 2017, members of an armed militant group known as the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army launched attacks against 30 Burmese police posts, sparking a disproportionate response from the Burma army. Thousands were killed and hundreds of villages burned, resulting in an estimated 626,000 people fleeing to Bangladesh. Reports of horrific human rights atrocities, including torture, mass rape, execution without trial, and the blocking of aid, took place. CSW calls on the government of Myanmar to take decisive action and echoes the Council's calls for the High Commissioner to monitor the human rights situation of the Rohingya people and to provide updates to the Council for a period of 3 years. Ethnic conflict against the Kachin and Shan peoples has also continued. 140,000 civilians have been displaced, 200 villages attacked, and 66 churches destroyed within the past 5 years. The judicial system has systematically failed to hold perpetrators of abuses to account. CSW urges the authorities to also release Damdor Nanglat and Langjor Gam Seng, who have committed no crime, having guided journalists to a church that was reportedly bombed by the Burmese army. We call on the international community to raise their case with the government of Myanmar. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. Now, Amnesty International has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Amnesty International shares concerns raised over the dramatic deterioration of the human rights situation in Myanmar over the past year. As we have heard, security forces have waged a vicious campaign of violence in northern Rakhine State, which clearly amounts to crimes against humanity. To date, over 670,000 people have fled to Bangladesh. The campaign to drive Rohingya out of Myanmar continues in the form of forced starvation, ongoing destruction of property, and the threat of further violence. Satellite imagery released by Amnesty International today clearly shows that the authorities are building over burnt Rohingya villages, including constructing new security bases, indicating an alarming militarization of the region. The appalling violations that have been perpetrated against the Rohingya shock the conscience. However, they do not occur in isolation. In northern Myanmar, the same military has been responsible for serious violations of international law, including torture, arbitrary detentions, unlawful killings, enforced disappearance, and indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas. Many of these violations constitute war crimes. The overwhelming majority of these violations have gone unpunished. Madam Vice President, while the military continues to violate rights with impunity, Myanmar's civilian-led government has proved itself to be unable and unwilling to hold those responsible to account. It is time for the international community to step in. We agree that it will be important for the UN to put in place a follow-up mechanism to ensure full accountability for perpetrators and justice for victims, and call on this Council to ensure the fact-finding mission's final report is formally transmitted to the General Assembly and the Security Council for immediate attention and action. Amnesty International supports the recommendation of the Special Rapporteur for the establishment of a structure in Cox's Bazar to collect and analyse evidence of human rights violations and abuses committed in Rakhine State, to support and facilitate independent international criminal proceedings. We urge this Council to mandate such a structure without delay during the current session. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. Now, Plan International has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Plan International welcomes the report of the Special Rapporteur and wishes to emphasize that all children should be treated first and foremost as children, regardless of their status. Life-saving humanitarian assistance should be the priority of the international community and all humanitarian actors. In northern Rakhine State, humanitarian operations remain a cause for concern. Plan International is calling on authorities to allow humanitarian actors who have permission to operate to restart activities immediately. We urge the government of Myanmar to allow UN agencies, representatives, and partners to visit and report on the situation to facilitate the assistance and support required to ensure that all children are able to reach their full potential. We urge the government of Myanmar to ease and facilitate the access of humanitarian assistance and protection to children in need and at risk, including displaced children. This should include age and gender-sensitive child protection interventions, food, water, and health services, and the provision of safe, inclusive, quality education for all children. Girls and boys, children and adolescents experience events and potential shocks differently. Age and gender considerations should be mainstreamed into all needs assessment and response plans relating to the human rights situation in Myanmar. The rights and needs of populations experiencing increased vulnerability, such as adolescent girls, unaccompanied and separated children, children under 5, and pregnant and lactating women and children should be prioritized. Plan International emphasizes that any and all returns to Rakhine State must respect the rights of all individuals and be underpinned by international law. Measures and safeguards should be put in place now to ensure that protection risks and potential human rights violations faced by displaced children, particularly girls returning to Myanmar, are mitigated and addressed. A human rights-based approach must be taken which recognizes children, particularly girls, as rights holders and key stakeholders in decisions that affect them. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. The floor goes to International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
Madam Vice President, Madam Rapporteur, members of the fact-finding mission, FIDH welcomes the Special Rapporteur's report and the fact-finding mission oral update. We condemn the Myanmar government's ongoing efforts to erase Rohingya existence and its continued denial and cover-up of the atrocities committed. In less than 18 months, security forces have almost emptied Rakhine State of its entire Rohingya population. The government's recent claim that the vast majority of Muslims in Rakhine State remain in their villages is blatantly false. The military's explanation that the massive Rohingya exodus to Bangladesh is the result of terrorists fleeing with their family members is preposterous and insulting. The government's refusal to grant the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission access to Myanmar shows that it is unwilling to foster accountability for crimes committed in ethnic minority areas, including Kachin and Shan states. We urge the Council to stand firm on the legitimate mandate of the Special Rapporteur and of the fact-finding mission to work unhindered by threats and obstruction. We support the High Commissioner's call for the Council to ask the GA to establish a new independent and impartial mechanism to bring perpetrators to justice. We remain disturbed by the government's failure to address other long-standing human rights issues. Nearly 100 political prisoners, including human rights defenders, journalists, activists and farmers, remain behind bars. They must be immediately released. Old and new laws that are inconsistent with international standards remain an obstacle to the full enjoyment of the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association. These draconian laws must be urgently scrapped or significantly reformed. As the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders turned 20, defenders across the country remain as vulnerable as ever. At least 5 of them have been killed over the past 18 months, and in most cases, no effective investigation has been conducted. It is imperative that the governments adopt specific measures to ensure the protection of human rights defenders. I thank you.
Thank you. Next is International Commission of Jurists, please.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The International Commission of Jurists welcomes the update of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission. In relation to crimes and international law, the ICJ encourages the experts to continue to develop further specific recommendations for securing criminal accountability and providing redress. The ICJ also welcomes the report of the Special Rapporteur and strongly supports the renewal of her mandate and tenure. As a UN member state, the government of Myanmar should fully cooperate with all the organs and mechanisms of the UN in accordance with its obligations under the UN Charter. At this session, the government asked for concrete evidence of alleged human rights violations and committed to taking action against perpetrators, but permission to enter the country is still refused to the fact-finding mission, to the Special Rapporteur and to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. To demonstrate a genuine commitment to truth and accountability, the government must allow them full access to areas of concern, particularly to Rakhine State, to conflict areas in Kachin State and Shan State. Humanitarian actors and independent media must also be immediately allowed full and unimpeded access, particularly to Rakhine State, as recommended by the government's own advisory commission. The current situation in Rakhine State is injurious to voluntary returns of Rohingya refugees. At the same time, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights must be included in repatriation planning with a full mandate to protect refugees. This is contemplated in the current repatriation arrangements with the government of Bangladesh, and the government of Myanmar must now formalize this relationship with the UNHCR. Experts, what can be done to ensure all UN agencies present in Myanmar actually put human rights up front, in line with the mandate of every UN organ under the UN Charter? Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Presse Emblème Campagne.
Thanks, Vice President. The President campaign thanks the Special Rapporteur of Myanmar for her report and wants to express its dismay about recent measures concerning the erosion of the press freedom in Myanmar. Two Reuters journalists, Walone and Kyo So-o, were arrested on December 12 in Yangon after being invited to meet police officials over dinner. 3 months later, they are killed. They are still behind bars. Both reporters were dedicated to the truth. On February 8, Reuters publishes the investigation that the reporter had been working on. It described how security forces and local Rakhine Buddhists were involved in the killing of 10 Rohingya Muslim men buried in a mass grave in Rakhine State. The two Reuters journalists have only done their job. Their detention brought back memories of repressive military rule. These detentions are another way for the government to censor information about the humanitarian catastrophe taking place in Rakhine State. The PEC considered that the presence of journalists in conflict zones is very important to witness violations from all parties. The United Nations have adopted in recent years 8 resolutions on the safety of journalists. Journalists must be able to do their job without fear, intimidation, and prosecution. Myanmar must stop blocking news coverage of Rohingya tragedy in Rakhine State. The two Reuters journalists must be immediately released. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Article 19, International Center Against Censorship.
Madam Vice President, Article 19 shares the Special Rapporteur's alarm that the repressive practices of previous military governments are returning as the norm once more, with crackdowns on free expression creating a culture of fear, silence and self-censorship. This retrogression contradicts many of the specific recommendations this Council directed to the government of Myanmar last year in Resolution 34/22. In the context of alleged acts of genocide and crimes against humanity, the government's attempts to control the free flow of information must be recognized as dangerous, undermining any possible efforts to prevent further violations, as well as prospects for accountability, for truth and reconciliation, and for the eventual safe return of refugees. We condemn in particular the targeting of journalists and others reporting on conflict-affected areas. Reuters journalists Walone and Jo So-u face up to 14 years imprisonment if convicted under the Official Secrets Act for reporting on a massacre of Rohingya civilians. In October 2017, 2 individuals were convicted under the Unlawful Associations Act for assisting journalists reporting on armed conflict in Shan State. Access to conflict-affected areas for the media remains restricted, limiting the public's access to information and enabling a government-led campaign of misinformation. Rather than condemn gross human rights violations and discrimination, government officials publicly question the veracity of reports and contribute to dehumanizing narratives concerning Rohingya Muslims against the plan of action in Resolution 1618, which itself is referenced in Resolution 34/22. We ask the Special Rapporteur if she shares Article 19's analysis that the deeply flawed draft bill on interfaith harmonious coexistence will, if adopted, make this situation worse rather than better. Section 66D of the Telecommunications Law and numerous provisions under the Penal Code are used to target expression critical of the government, including online. We fully support the Special Rapporteur's recommendations to repeal or reform laws that restrict democratic space and ask what measures the Council can take to ensure these reforms are prioritised by the government. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Asian Legal Resource Center.
Madam Vice President, the Asian Legal Resource Center finds the report and oral updates presented by the Special Rapporteur and the Chairperson of Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar as true reflections of the ground realities. The ALRC and its partner Odhika has been conducting fact-finding missions on the situation of Rohingyas. Since October 2016, we have interviewed over 200 Rohingya refugees who were forced to flee to Bangladesh to save their lives. The victims are mostly women. They provided graphic description about what they had faced in the Rakhine State. Among the survivors, Mrs. Dilda Begum, a 30-year-old mother, told us that 19 members of her family were killed before her eyes. On 29 August 2017, Totmadao and local Buddhist extremists attacked their house in Tulatuli village of Mongdo Township. The soldiers surrounded the villagers, separated the young women and girls, killed the men, women and children and buried the bodies in 6 trenches at Tulatuli swamp. The soldiers took survivors, including Mrs. Dilda, 4 of her children, other young women, to a house in the same village where she saw many bodies of women and children. The floor of the house had pool of blood. The Tatmadaw soldiers gang raped her. They hit her children with rifle bars and smashed their heads. 3 of her children died there. The soldiers hit her in the head too. Having setting fire to the house, the soldiers left. Dilda and her 10-year-old daughter only managed to survive and flee to Bangladesh. Many victims of Netchang village of Mongdo and Shoprang village of Butidong township shared similar horrific experiences with our human rights defenders. These accounts by the victims suggest that genocide continues in the Rakhine state. By preventing access to the crime scene, Myanmar cannot simply blame the UN independent experts. The international community, particularly the UN, should have access to the country to obtain evidence before they are destroyed. The ALRC looks forward to the conclusion of the fact-finding mission about the alleged commission of genocide and urges the Council to take action and justice afforded to the victims. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Human Rights Now.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. This January, Human Rights Now visited refugee camps in surrounding areas of Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, and spoke with numerous Rohingya who have fled from violence in Myanmar since August 2017. During the visit, we heard multiple accounts of atrocities witnessed and experienced by Rohingya at the hands of Myanmar security forces, including killings, rape, arbitrary detention, torture, and arson. Some of the interviewees, including numerous children, also showed us physical evidence of violence they had received. A recent media report on the finding of a mass grave is the newest piece of evidence suggesting ethnic cleansing against Rohingya. This report suggests serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. On March 7th, in this Council, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, expressed strong suspicions that acts of genocide may have taken place in Rakhine State since August. We share his view and express our utmost concern over the situation. Madam Vice President, we urge Myanmar authorities to end military operations and human rights abuses in Rakhine State and to ensure justice and accountability over the alleged crimes committed by security forces and persons acting under their direction. Myanmar must fully collaborate with UN Special Rapporteur, the Council's fact-finding mission and other UN bodies. We also urge Myanmar to immediately release the detained reporters, Wallon and KCO, and end oppression over freedom of the press. Madam Vice President, we call on the UN Human Rights Council to adopt strong and effective measures to stop the ongoing atrocities. The international community must implement a comprehensive arms embargo, targeted sanctions, and refer the situation to the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mari Foundation for Peace and Development has the floor.
Madam, the Rohingya people, according to several reports, is amongst the peoples in the world that is most exposed to violence and the violation of their own rights. Their rights are denied. They are among the people whose rights are most denied in the world. There are several reports attest to the fact that their rights to fundamental freedoms and justice and security are flouted. What is the situation today in the light of the texts adopted by the United Nations to impose the respect of these rights? It is not possible today for these citizens to be able to live on their own territories and exercise their own rights. The state of Myanmar is exercising terrorism systematically against its own citizens. The Rohingyas in Rakhine State, they are exposed to suffering, and this under the conspiracy of the security forces, and they have to live in refugee camps. 80% of these people live in refugee camps abroad, not in Myanmar. They live in circumstances that are humiliating, but they are entitled to respect and dignity. They are entitled to justice and entitled to the person responsible for the crimes be brought to justice, and for them to be able to go back to their own villages in all security after having been expelled from their villages. The children are amongst the most vulnerable. They're exposed to the suffering and to torture. And if we do not impose the respect of the rights of the child in these circumstances, we cannot aspire to the respect of the rights of the adults in turn. These children have a right to education and to health and to dignity. And these children are entitled to survival, because without the right to survival they cannot enjoy their other rights. These children also are entitled to have travel documents so that they can exercise their right to security.
Union of Arab Jurists, please. I hear they're absent. I call on Alliance Creative Community Project. Absent. International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We appreciate the update reports by the fact-finding mission and the Special Rapporteur. We share the Special Rapporteur's grave concern at the Bangladesh-Myanmar repatriation agreement, which would force Rohingya refugees to return from camps in Bangladesh to so-called temporary accommodation expected to be prison-like camps in Myanmar that Rohingya have been returned to previously. Rohingya refugees are very clear that they will return to Myanmar only if their safety is assured by the international community, their lands returned and houses rebuilt, if they are granted full citizenship and no longer subjected to discrimination and persecution. These conditions are not met. Moreover, Rohingya refugees were not consulted throughout the planning of their return. Bangladesh agreed to repatriate refugees to the state-sponsored system of apartheid that is still in place in Myanmar. Refoulement is an absolute prohibition under international human rights and refugee law. IFOD and Geneva International Center for Justice consider the repatriation deal extremely immature and are convinced that it will result in further human rights violations against the Rohingya minority. To implement any repatriation plan, an unconditional end to violence and guarantees of non-recurrence must be ensured. Secondly, we are seriously concerned that refugees and international agencies, including UNHCR, are excluded from all stages of this repatriation. Rohingya should play a key role in the planning and management of their return. Thirdly, the required verification process is contentious. The Myanmar authorities denied the Rohingya citizenship and deprived them of any possibility to prove their identity for decades. Under these circumstances, it is unreasonable to expect Rohingya refugees to present the necessary documents for voluntary repatriation. Lastly, we are mindful of previous repatriations of tens of thousands of Rohingya to Myanmar in the 1990s and early 2000s. We call upon all relevant actors to ensure that Rohingya refugees are not forced back to Myanmar as long as they remain at risk of serious human rights violations. Eventual voluntary repatriation should take place under the supervision of international human rights monitors and the relevant UN agencies.
Madam. Sorry. Next speaker is Prahar. Absent. I call on Child Foundation.
Madam Vice President, with the human rights situation in Myanmar quickly worsening, immediate action needs to be taken to support and aid the Rohingya minority groups who have been displaced, tortured and silenced by their own government. In order to make up for severe limits to humanitarian access and a lack of support and overall sense of abandonment faced by refugees, we must come together as an international community to aid those that have continually been denied their rights as humans. In the coming year, we expect that the well-being of refugees, as well as those still suffering in country, to be considered the first priority by managing the situation in Myanmar. We call upon this Council and the rest of the international community to focus negotiating efforts on ensuring clear passage for humanitarian aid into Myanmar. By engaging in dialogue with the government, hopefully we can encourage cooperation and clarify the goals of the humanitarian community to aid those affected rather than challenging those who may be responsible for their suffering. Finally, recent reports of the Bangladeshi government's participation in deporting Myanmar refugees is deeply concerning because of the situation many of these escapees are likely to face when they return home. In order to assist those who face the reality of deportation and the potential dangerous outcomes these movements should have on their safety and well-being, we would like to call upon the Human Rights Council to issue a statement requesting that the Bangladeshi government cease to participate in this plan to repatriate refugees. Additionally, we believe the focus should be placed on refugees in other countries, such as Thailand, in order to improve the lives of those who have escaped what can be characterized as a violent ethnic cleansing.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
International Education Development has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. International Educational Development and the Association of Humanitarian Lawyers have addressed the situation in Burma, Myanmar since 1990 and have focused mainly on the situation of the ethnic nationalities. The Special Rapporteur indicates that the current situation of the ethnic nationalities has deteriorated. We note that this is in spite of the government's promises made regarding peace processes. We also note the prior recommendation made by the Rapporteur that the Human Rights Council hold an urgent and dedicated discussion about the situation with Kachin, Shan, and Kayin states. We would also add the areas of all the areas of ethnic nationalities. Does she mean that the Council hold a standalone session on this? We remind the Council that Burma, Myanmar is not a unified country, and that the ethnic nationalities all have armies and control vast tracts. A standalone session on this, with reference to the Geneva Conventions and all universally recognized rules of armed conflict, would be very useful. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. This was the last speaker on the list that we are able to accommodate, and I will now give the floor to Mrs. Lee for her concluding remarks. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. I want to address a few questions that were posed this afternoon. There were still some remaining questions regarding the structure that I have recommended, and I have explained it earlier, but let me try to supplement my explanation. The structure should be a parallel to the repatriation agreement timeline. Accordingly, the two countries have agreed that in 2 years' time the repatriation would be completed. I feel that the structure should be mandated for 3 years because things may slow down, and I'd like to also see what happens after the repatriation to the other side. The fact-finding mission has a limited year of one year. It's subject to renewal, and the documentation needs a longer-term mandate with staff, technical and technological support, and funds. And this structure is also complementary to what the President of the fact-finding mission is also recommending. How soon? We would like to have it have been yesterday. Something of this nature should have been constructed yesterday, but expediency is the key. As I mentioned earlier, the rain season, the monsoon, and the cyclone seasons, we may see the Rohingya be redisplaced or relocated to other areas, and we would need, the urgency is paramount. What can be done to facilitate access? I'd like to urge the member states to reach out to Myanmar and try to urge them and convince them as a responsible member of the international community that they revisit their decision. To be perfectly honest, it really saddens me to see the path that Myanmar has taken in the past 2 years. What kind of humanitarian assistance? If you look at the recent Médecins Sans Frontières came out with a full report. They came out with a brief report in December, but they just came out with a full report. 58% are children in Cox's Bazar. 60% are girls and women, and we estimate about 400,000 Rohingya children are in need of immediate services. What kind of services? They would, first and foremost, they need post-traumatic stress interventions, psychosocial interventions, and this will be a long-term process. It's not a one-off, a brief intervention, believe me, because I work with psychotherapeutic approaches to children. MSF just came out with the report saying that they have witnesses rape victims between the as young as 9 years old. They've treated rape victims as young as 9 years old. Another very immediate assistance that is warranted is the provision of education. Education is the only thing that will bring normalcy back to traumatized children. Provision of livelihoods. Also, provisions of education and other support needs to also go to the host community. What are the concrete evidence? These are the concrete evidence, and this reported by Médecins Sans Frontières. In terms of how to ensure accountability, this is, I refer back to my recommendation to the structure. But this doesn't mean that it only is targeting the Tatmadaw or the security forces or the government of Myanmar. We have to recognize, we have to remember that there are other communities that had suffered from the attacks by ARSA, and including the Maro, the Dainet, and the Hindu population. Are there any pattern of violation throughout Myanmar? Yes. Militarization in the ceasefire agreement signatory areas is also a very big sign. In terms of universal birth registration, the Myanmar government has declared that they will pursue a universal birth registration, but I would like to highlight that in non-government controlled areas too. I want to close by sharing with you an account which has left me distressed until today. In Cox's Bazar, I met a grandmother who had fled Rakhine State with her daughter-in-law and grandson. The 3-year-old boy with big innocent eyes came up to me and simply said, "They chopped up my father." No one, let alone a child, should ever have to witness the killing of their parent. No child should ever have to recount such a dreadful incident. No child should ever have to grow up with this horrific visual memory the rest of their lives. I have 2 children. Ladies and gentlemen, you also may have children. Some of you may even have grandchildren. Imagine if this was your own child or grandchild. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Mr. Darusman for concluding remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I will be very brief. Some of the questions that were posed have been answered regarding the support of the international community. One question that remains to be addressed is one that has to do with resources that was posed by the UK. And I will invite Mr. Khitchadeth to address this briefly. Thank you.
Thank you. Just briefly, this question is linked to the question from Bangladesh about credible evidence. We have a great deal of information, and we are finding that much of it constitutes credible evidence. But what happens after the fact-finding mission has completed its work is another matter. The Council was very generous to us last September in the PBI that approved resources for our extension. ACABQ in New York, regrettably, was not quite so generous as you were. And as a result, we have a serious problem with the archiving of the credible evidence that we are collecting, and therefore of its availability to future mechanisms that may be established by the Council or the GA or wherever. So in response to the UK, we do have a budgetary problem. specifically in relation to ensuring that the material that we collect is usable by later mechanisms. That's not a problem that is the result of Council decisions, but of ACABQ decisions in New York. And in the context of some follow-up mechanism, it's a matter that the Council will need to address.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. And with that, we end our clarification and response to the Council. Thank you for the questions, and I'll give the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. This brings us to the end of the clustered interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Myanmar and the fact-finding mission on Myanmar. And I wish to thank Mrs. Lee, Mr. Darusman, Mrs. Kumaraswamy and Mr. Sidoti for their presentations, for their presence here and their answers to our questions, and all of the participants who have contributed to the discussion. Thank you. And we shall take now a very short break before proceeding with the enhanced interactive dialogue on the human rights situation in Eritrea. I kindly ask that you remain seated.